What's a harmless thing from your childhood that's actually kind of dark in hindsight? Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. My mom had breast cancer when I was pretty young, and I thought it was a normal life stage. Once I was drawing pictures of myself throughout my life, and I drew myself in grade school, then in college, then when I got my first job, when I got married, had kids, had breast cancer, retired, had grandkids, etc. Like each of those things were normal milestones. Story 2. Being 4, sent into a convenience store with a note to buy my mom's Lark cigarettes, then using the car lighter to start one. As in, putting the filter up to my lips, taking the lit lighter out, and inhaling a puff or two to get it started before handing it to her as she drove. She couldn't go inside because she had to stay in the car with my 2-year-old brother and was 8 months pregnant. Yes, 4 years old. Gen Xer. Story 3. Being left in a car for hours while my dad went and did bot. Nothing bad ever happened, but when I slip up and casually mention it to people, they treat me like I was kept in a cage. Instantly makes me remember that it isn't a thing to happen, and was probably more dangerous than I perceived it to be. Story 4. Over the years, I picked up the ability to numb out, space out, and forget things, which apparently is a trauma response. What's my trauma? Who knows? I was too busy numbing out and forgetting. Story 5. My mom was really big on always telling me the truth, and that sounds like a good, harmless thing. But when there are no boundaries and heavy, difficult, painful, scary information is shared with a 4-year-old without age-appropriate modifications or protections. Yikes. Story 6. When I was little, I would listen to music on the radio. I laid on my stomach on the floor of my room and would stare at a small ball and daydream for hours at a time. I thought it was normal and I was just poor and bored. Apparently, I was maladaptive, daydreaming, and dissociating from my traumatic life with formerly homeless and druggy parents. Story 7. Being praised for my skinny body or adults commenting on it as if I wasn't a young prepubescent kid. You can imagine the lasting effects as my body changed over the decades and trying to accept myself for not being the same size as a skinny child. Story 8. When my grandma died, I was 15, and the baby is the family. She died in her own bed in her bedroom. There was such an influx of relatives over her last 48 hours that the house ran out of room, including blow-up mattresses, couches, etc. My uncle down the street similarly ran out of room. The one unoccupied room was Grandma's bedroom. So the grown-ups decided that I'd get to sleep in there, and I was so young it definitely wouldn't impact me at all, even though the thought of sleeping on her bed in the room where she died was unthinkable to them. I love telling this story and seeing people's faces. It's so terrible, it's hilarious. Story 9. I grew up in a rural community with nothing to do. For entertainment, when we'd see ambulances or smoke or anything similar, my mom would put us in the car to go investigate. I remember being very young ambulance chasers. It seemed exciting when I was little. Now I'm like, WTH, thank goodness we never saw anything overly traumatic. I wouldn't expose my kid to such things. Story 10. I was fighting with my sister in the back seat of the car. Mom pulled over, made me get out, and drove away. I was all alone under a highway underpass for about 10 minutes until they came back. I suppose I was 9 years old. I do not trust my mom at all to this day, and I have some abandonment issues. Story 11. When as a little kid, I asked my dad for permission to do something that he didn't want to say yes to. He'd instead pretend it was my mom asking, not me, and threatened to beat her up for asking. It was his way of letting me know it was a no. I remember my brother crying because he got a bad grade, and my dad threatened to hit my mom as if she was the one that got the bad mark. My dad actually uses it as an example for why such actions were necessary. My brother never got a low mark ever again. Story 12. My mom constantly cleaning. Once I watched her give her friend a cup of coffee. She turned and wiped the counter, then took the coffee cup, emptied it, washed it, and put it away. The friend never even got to take a sip. She swept, mopped, and vacuumed daily, even checked under beds for dust. Realized years later that it was a sign of my dad's abuse. He was awful. Story 13. My mom is obsessed with puppies, kittens, and babies to an extent. As a child, it was normal for us to have 2 or 3 dogs and cats at once. And being the oldest child, I was expected to look after them and train them. Then every year or so, she would wait for my sister and I to go to school, and would sell the dogs and cats to someone else. A new puppy or kitten would be there when we got home, and if we ever mentioned the other animals, she would say, "This is your dog. Cat now. Talk about this one," and then the whole cycle would start again. I was so attached to the dogs in particular, and always wondered what happened to them. I didn't realize this was so harmful to me until she did it again last month, and wanted my young son to be excited about her new puppy. I surprised myself with the strength of my response. She's still avoiding speaking to me, and I'm not mad about it. Story 14. My sister and I would be seen, not heard, not want anything to eat or drink when offered while visiting others, and all parents wanting their kids to be like us. Realized later, this was trauma. We were minimizing ourselves, wants, needs, thoughts, because we felt we were a burden at home. Story 15. As a child, my mother would get angry at me for not grooming myself properly and not cleaning up around the house. Meanwhile, she never taught me how to do any personal grooming, cleaning, or chores. She just expected me to somehow magically figure it out on my own and would get angry if I didn't do something or did it wrong. Story 16. Had a garage refrigerator full of canned soda in nearly every brand and flavor, with no limitations or restrictions on how many I could have. Needless to say, I hated water for much of my life and still struggled to drink it without adding flavoring. Proud to say I haven't had a single soda in 3 years. Story 17. Our house didn't have power sometimes or basic utilities because we were dead broke, so my mom would make games out of it and say we were camping. Sorta. Of course, naive me wouldn't understand what was going on, but yeah, we weren't just eating ramen noodles in the dark for fun. Oddly thought it was really the only times I had a normal bond with my mom, as she was quite abusive. Something about the situation just made her calm. Story 18. My mom used to hold my brother and I down and tickle us until we cried and begged her to stop. She said, "You're laughing, so you must like it." As a kid, her being my mom made it hard for me to stand up for myself. Now, anytime someone tickles me, I just shut down or start crying or yelling after I catch my breath. That was a fun conversation with my boyfriend. Story 19. What did Durissa Rinewawan? Seeing one parent for an hour between work and the bar, seeing the other every other weekend, buying smokes at 7 years old for the women in the neighborhood, passing a beer to the driver because it's okay if it's only 3, sitting on the floor of the cargo van because standing was dangerous. The deadbolts on the door used a key for both sides. Story 20. A few years ago, I was talking to a friend about how I would go over to my dad's house. Over the weekend, every other week was the custody agreement, and clean everything. And instead of laughing with me, he had a very serious face and said, "I'm sorry." That wasn't even one of the bad things. It was a bit polarizing. I really don't know what's normal because I still feel like that's not even bad. Story 21. When I was 8 or 9, my older male cousins would send me into the convenience store with money to buy whatever they wanted because the guy at the counter would always give me free stuff if I was alone. Dude got arrested for being a child predator a few years into my teens. I'm lucky I never took him up on his offer of checking the back for more snacks with him. Story 22. My dad would threaten to put me in military school whenever he would get mad at me when I was like 5, 8 years old. Like put me away in boarding school where I would be alone for a long time. One time he even put me in the car and just started driving, and I screamed and cried and pleaded until he turned around after a long time. I think that's why I'm incredibly scared of doing anything wrong now, and am a huge people pleaser. Story 23. I would pretend to record my older brother and mother fighting. Like a movie, I could replay it again and again as a way of getting back at my brother. It doesn't make sense, I know. Turns out that was actually a form of disassociating and removing myself from the verbal abuse I was witnessing. Story 24. My dad was a long-haul trucker, and my mom worked at a bar. When my dad was on the road and my mom had to work nights, she would put my sister and I, about 6 and 7, in our pajamas with some toys and snacks and lock us in the car in the bar parking lot for her shift. Then she'd drive home and carry us sleeping to bed. We would have to get ourselves up and to school in the morning because she'd be sleeping after work. Story 25. When I was a kid, my dad told me and both my siblings a story called The Grasshopper and the Ant. It's apparently a fable from somewhere, but no one else seems to know it when I mention the story. The simplest, fastest retelling is that the grasshopper and ant lived in the same part of the forest. All summer, the grasshopper played his fiddle and enjoyed the sun. Meanwhile, the ant worked as hard as he could all summer to put food and firewood up for winter. He told the grasshopper over and over, "If you don't do something now, You'll starve and freeze, but the grasshopper didn't worry. Then came winter, and the ant was all warm and snug in his hidey hole, with plenty of food only to hear a terrible knocking on the door. He opened it to find the grasshopper, standing in the snow, half frozen. The grasshopper begged for a place to stay and food for the winter. The Annie was right. He was dying outside. The ant reluctantly agreed he could spend the winter, and the grasshopper fiddled their winter away. My father always ended this story by looking us right in the eye and going, "And you're the ant," in my case. He told my older sibling they were the grasshopper, and to this day, one of their online bios reads, "Always the grasshopper, never the ant." Looking back, I cannot imagine why he would have told any of his kids that they were doomed to always need the charity of others to figure their life out, or that they would always be stuck taking in, fixing things for other people. Because who boy did 7-year-old me take that damn story to heart. Story 26. We had a highway in our backyard, and whenever there was an accident, my father would get the flashlight and take me, and we'd go to investigate. One time there was a motorcycle accident, and I saw the helmet. Then I saw the body, but it had no head. It was in the helmet. I was about 10 years old. Obviously at 63, I still never forget it. Story 27. Me and my sister having to leave the bedroom door open as we got changed because my dad would get upset. My mother would tell us we made him feel like a stranger in his own home. Yeah, he was an abusive pedophile. Story 28. I'm reading this for ideas, lol. It's hard to remember all the things because there were so many. At the time, I knew they weren't harmless, like a deep knowledge, but I didn't have the words to explain why. I knew what a normal family should look like by watching things like Full House, Family Matters, and etc. One thing I haven't seen mentioned here yet is that my dad would visit churches like other people visit museums. He just loved the spectacle. Russian Orthodox, black churches, super conservative Pentecostal, primitive Baptist, etc. He would find something he liked, go for a while, then have a problem, and we would move on. He'd talk about how crazy some of them were with just glee. I was supposed to take the Christian faith seriously, and he demanded it. But I could tell he had no real convictions or roots. It's like he was looking for the perfect set of rules that would make him feel whole. Story 29. Not a story from my own childhood, as it was fairly normal with a few weird, dysfunctional family members drifting in and out, but from a few years after marrying my husband. One time he told me, I didn't actually realize how weird my childhood was until we started dating, because I would be telling a story and laughing, and I'd see the look of horror on your face. 17 years later, and with 3 kids of our own, he definitely realizes how messed up some of the stuff he experienced was. Story 30. My dad taking me with him to the pub when I was 7. I got a Coke and peanuts and was happy. I was a well-behaved, calm, easygoing kid. I could sit still for hours. It wasn't a family-friendly pub. It was a pub for drinkers. I realized much later that he only took me because he couldn't leave me at home and he wanted a drink. For so long, I thought it was a nice thing between us. Story 31. My ex's parents made his 8-year-old brother pack a suitcase, put him in the car, drove him to a group home house for troubled youth, and forced him out of the car. They only revealed the bluff when he started sobbing so loudly people around took notice. They told this story at every Christmas. Story 32. When I was really young, I was really lonely, and my parents' response to that was, I was lonely when I was your age too, and not much else. And then when I thought I was finally making friends, it was this incredibly messed up hypersexual kid who got expelled from school like 3 months later. Story 33. My dad used to drive us to church on Sundays, and all of us kids would pile in the back of his pickup truck. Sometimes for fun, he'd cut through the bunny field on the way, and we'd watch dozens and dozens of rabbits spring out of the way from the sides of the truck, and we'd laugh and shout for him to go faster. Took me years to realize we were killing hundreds of rabbits, crushing entire nests of little babies, and the mothers keeping them safe and warm were just barely escaping. So many animals were probably left to suffer slow and painful deaths because we thought it was entertaining to watch them desperately flee for their lives. Story 34. When I told my mother that other kids were bullying me, she replied by saying, "What did you do to deserve it?" When I said nothing, she scoffed and said, "They must have a good reason." Then she promptly did nothing to stop the bullying. This was the same woman who bullied me every time I showed my autistic traits, so I'm not exactly surprised by her response. Story 35. My parents always encouraging me to draw and buying me pencils, art supplies for every birthday, and telling everyone how much I love drawing. No, I don't love drawing and I'm not good at it either. It's just a convenient way to make a kid shut up and disappear. Story 36. Parents were business owners. I don't want to sound spoiled in saying any of this. Please take this with a grain of salt in my autism. The toys were nice. The freedom was nice. The money was nice. The private school was nice. But from age 3-10, my parents were hardly home. They couldn't tell you my favorite color or my favorite food. They couldn't tell you my friends' names. They didn't have my friends' parents' numbers because my babysitters that would swap out yearly would have to do it all. I still yearn for what my childhood could have been. Knowing my friends had their parents to help them with their homework, make them snacks after school, get tucked into bed, and just not have to be so responsible. I know I have to get over it, but I still think about what it could have been all the time. And now that I'm older, my mom doesn't work anymore. My dad's just 3, his work. God knows why. He has enough money. Story 37. At 11, I was regularly babysitting for my neighbor's newborn on weekends. I'd walk over to their house in the afternoon, say 5 p.m., and they would point out ingredients I could use to make myself dinner, let me know I could help myself to the 2-liter of pop in the fridge, and set out a can of formula. Then they'd come back around 11 p.m. or midnight, pay me like $20, and I'd walk home. They were a very nice couple. Nothing weird happened. I had taken a babysitting class with my Girl Scout troop a few years prior, and I'd been babysitting regularly since I was like 9 or 10. I thought it was no big deal, and neither did my parents. I actually liked babysitting younger babies more than older ones, because the little ones only took bottles, and you didn't have to feed them baby food or cereal and clean up the mess. Looking back, these people left their infant with a literal child. They did not tell me where they were going, assumed I knew how to feed, burp, diaper, bathe, and dress a baby, expected me to cook for myself, and trusted me to not kill their baby or burn their house down. Story 38. Our mother letting us play in the swamp unsupervised, knowing we were jumping into the brackish water in the forest where the trees had made a pool. Or the time she knew my siblings were jumping off playground equipment at the beach or out of a tree onto a flat rock in the yard. How we all survived into adulthood is a mystery to me. Story 39. My dad used to call me Wantin, Irella, like Cinderella, but my real name for the first half. He thought it was the funniest joke because I wasn't actually his daughter. He had adopted me when I was 2, and he never loved me like his real daughters. So I was the, literally, red-headed stepchild no one wanted. He started calling me that after a big fight when I was 8, where he yelled at me that I wasn't even his, I was adopted. After that, he just thought it was such a funny joke, and he told it to everyone that came to our house and then explained the entire thing every time. It wasn't until years later that I realized none of the other adults laughed with him. I also think he completely missed the point of Cinderella. Story 40. When I was 8 years old in the 80s, I ran across the street one night to ask a neighbor how to scramble an egg because I was hungry. I had to do this because my dad and stepmother were gone for the weekend in another state on a road trip, and my 12-year-old stepsister, who was supposed to watch me, left to her friend's house, and I was alone. Often left to my own devices, often family never locked any doors or windows, parents were drug dealers. All was normal to me back then. Story 41. 5th grade in the 2000s, the girls were all into witchcraft. We were making blood packs and we'd pretend we were shapeshifters while running around the local cemetery. We were also doing normal things the rest of the time, but damn, the early 2000s brought us the movies 13 and Cruel Intentions, Stigmata, Practical Magic, and shows like Buffy. Story 42, He-Man. If you think about it, it taught a generation the exactly wrong message. That strength doesn't come from hard work, that problems are easily solved by a magical sword that just requires you to be good to be worthy of strength, but not require any actual effort to achieve that strength. You didn't have to earn it, just be worthy of it. When you stop and think about it, it's a really message to teach children. Story 43, When I was a kid, my mom and I lived with my grandparents for a year. I had discovered adult videos and responded to them as most do in my room. One night, I heard my grandpa's footsteps go from upstairs to downstairs outside my bedroom. He slowly creaked my door open. He looked at me with a chilling expression and said flatly, "I know what you do at night," and then he closed my door and walked back upstairs. It really creeped me out at the time. There were lots of ways I read into it, and I even disclosed what I thought to a family member at one point, but they said it was nothing. I didn't realize how thin the walls are at their house until much later, so I thought maybe that was his way of scaring me into stopping. Things seem normal between he and I today, and for the past years, but I still find it off-putting, not knowing what he was trying to achieve with that interaction. He said some other strange things to me in the past, but I chalked it up to me overthinking. Story 44. Okay, this is more harmless from my point of view at the time. Now it's extremely fucked up. My mate's mom took a real shine to me growing up. I knew her from 13, 16-ish. I was abused as a kid and starved of attention from adults, so I lent into this hard. We started texting outside of me seeing my friend. Then she started flirting with me. It progressed to us having phone and swapping pictures with each other. This woman was a minimum of 40 when I was 14. Grew up and realized how deeply wrong and fucked up that situation was. Story 45. My dad acted like a kid himself. Everything was always hilarious, but he could flip like a switch too. His tantrums were legendary. Sometimes he'd just leave or take my sister and I somewhere and never pick us up. Spontaneous trips were common, whether it was a middle-of-the-night drive or a trip to another state. I'm full of insane stories that were some of my happiest. As an adult, I'm learning that he had BPD and was unmedicated. It's a mind to look back on your happiest memories and realize there's now a taint to them. The worst is when I'm telling what I think is a funny little anecdote to people, and they give me looks of pity. Sorry if I'm trauma dumping, Lola. Story 46. When I was around 14, I was having an early coffee in the local park with my dad. As one of the waiters was coming over to bring the drinks, I hadn't met this one before, he said to my dad, "Ah, so this must be your mistress?" We laughed it off as a slightly weird, offhand joke, and my father explained that I was his daughter, after which the man apologized. Found the interaction a little bit weird, but thought not much of it. Fast forward 4 years, and it turns out my dad has spent 15 years cheating on my mom, with not only several relationships and affairs, but seeing hundreds, maybe even thousands of escorts and prostitutes. He was quite close with that one waiter, and apparently sometimes brought the women to the cafe with him. Some of them were only a few years older than me. That's why the waiter had assumed I was one of them. Story 47. I didn't think seeing my dad and my mom's boyfriend at the time waving guns while yelling at each other through a window one morning was that big of a deal at the time, considering the rest of my childhood had much crazier events. Now I realize that it was pretty crazy. I was around 9 or so at the time. There were many occurrences of seeing my dad point and wave guns at people, so I thought it was not a big deal. Story 48. I got hurt a lot as a kid. I figured all kids were rough and tumble and got into fights. Grew up in a very racist town. Other kids weren't afraid to go way over the top with weapons and violence, and the police didn't seem to be above hurting a child. Detached retina, bone scarring all through my face, torn cartilage in my ear, broken nose. All of my front teeth are chipped, burn scars, skull fractures, many broken bones. I didn't realize other people didn't have that experience growing up. I guess I was in denial, but I figured these things just happen. Story 49. The one that I genuinely had no idea wasn't normal was that my parents used to make fun of me and mock me when I would cry. They would imitate me and tell me I looked ugly and sounded stupid when I cried. I casually mentioned this to my husband in a joking manner, and he was so pained by it, he had to stop what he was doing to hug me. Story 50. After I had my son, I put on over 12 kilos in less than 2 weeks. Turns out my thyroid completely died. Along with other health issues and extreme PPD, I was not in a good place. My mom and aunties all laughed and said things like, "Welcome to the fat club, and we told you this would happen and you wouldn't be skinny forever." The constant comments about how skinny I was and how one day you'll be fat like us destroyed me growing up, and then I was mocked when it came to fruition. It's taken me years to lose the weight and recover from PPD. I'm still working on a healthy relationship with my body. Story 51. Groundings meant I couldn't leave my room. My siblings couldn't talk to me. I couldn't be part of any family functions, birthdays, graduation, restaurant outings with the grandparents, and I couldn't eat meals with anyone else. Books became my escape. I was questioned every time I left my room to use the bathroom or to get a glass of water. Sometimes my groundings included a chore, like the dishes or cleaning the bathrooms. And looking back, the punishments never fit the crimes. I never was out past curfew. Hell, I was never out. I had mediocre grades, but I wasn't a terrible student. When I tried going to a dance with my boyfriend, my parents insisted that I was trying to go and have with him, and continued to guilt trip me into telling them everything that happened during said dance, or I'd be grounded. It made me very sneaky with my text conversations. When I heard how my other friends had groundings, I was a little upset, and I swear I won't do that to my own kids. Story 52. The constant kitchen mess. My mom still leaves meat bits on a cutting board out overnight. My dad leaves glasses with water and juice out. And then my mom wonders why they get flies. They also wonder why I'm hell-bent on not moving back in with them. I'll be the first to admit I'm messy, but I'm certainly not that kind. I just have general clutter and dust. Story 53. Coming home from school or waking up home alone and being terrified that the rapture happened and I was left alone. My family always used how God wouldn't want us during the end times as a threat when we did something bad. Memorization of religious texts from a young age, forcing my oldest sister for years upon years in her room to eat dinner alone every night while we had family dinner. The wooden spoon, belt, hot showers, and hot sauce or soap would also hear, "Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about." Story 54. When I was 15 in high school, I took a media studies class basically because the teacher was chill and we could just goof off for a class. Anyway, there was this time when the teacher pulled me aside and gave me an Andy Warhol film to watch. Like the literal VHS tape. I can't remember what it was called, but from memory it looked very 70s. Anyway, the opening scene is literally a dude hanging dong, clearly sexually assaulting a woman on a couch. I have never moved so fast in my life. My parents were in the next room, somehow didn't see or hear anything, and I just ripped out the tape, put it back in my school bag. Next day, I gave the tape to a friend and said something like, "Mr. M gave this to me. It's kind of weird." A few days later, the teacher came up to me, super pissed that I gave that movie to another student. I don't recall anything verbatim, but he was saying things like, "It was only meant for me. I shouldn't have shown that to the other student," etc. It wasn't until I'd left school that I realized just how fucked up that is. Really didn't linger too much on my mind as a teenager, but yeesh. Story 55. In kindergarten, we got a substitute teacher who announced that she would be staying as our teacher for the rest of the year. She was a really nice lady, and I liked her more anyway, so yay. Found out years later my actual teacher was out because she was getting investigated to see if she'd failed her duties as a mandated reporter. A girl in my class was apparently being abused by her father. They must have found it in her favor because she was back for the next school year and several more afterwards until she retired. Story 56. OH. Do I ever have one? Maybe not childhood, but teenage. So my dad died when I was 14, and my mom was depressed, experiencing great sorrow. I had one bad panic attack and decided to sleep in her room for a couple of weeks. One night, I was having a nightmare. It was one of the recurring ones that I usually had, so I was used to the general theme of things. An entity with red eyes was chasing me throughout my house. I ran out the front door, up the driveway, and onto the street, and of course, the entity was there. Something was different this time. The entity actually caught me from behind, around my waist and mouth, which had never happened before. I was struggling. I woke up and my mom had both of her hands around my mouth-worn face. I flew out of bed and asked her, "What the?" She said she did it because I was screaming. I stopped sleeping in her bed and never thought much about it until I was in my 30s, when I realized, holy, she was depressed. She wasn't on any proper dose of any medication at the time and was going through extreme highs and lows. She would frequently talk to herself and tell her own thoughts. "Stop it," out loud as she would walk around the house. I will never actually know if she was going through it just then and legit tried to off me, or if I truly was screaming in my sleep and she truly believed that covering my mouth was the correct course of action. Also, trying to help someone while they sleep, dream sleepwalk, is seemingly harmless, but please don't do that. No touchy. Story 57. When I was a kid, ages 5'8", my mom looked after a couple of her friends' kids pretty regularly for extra cash since she didn't work at the time. One boy she watched several days a week from when he was an infant to about 3 years, and there were a couple of other infants she or toddlers around regularly. But looking back, I'm 100% sure none of their mothers knew that my mom left for hours at a time every day and had me taking care of them. She would just go get lunch or run errands or whatever, and I was in charge of the babies' feedings, diapers, whatever they needed. Super glad no emergencies ever happened, BC. This was before cell phones, and I was definitely unaware of 911 or any sort of emergency protocols. I was also supposed to be being homeschooled at the time, but the only thing I ever remember was my mom doing in regards to that was leaving me with a Play School cassette player and a big plastic binder full of Hooked on Phonics tapes so I'd learn to read. Story 58. My mom led me to believe through a large portion of childhood that we had cameras and listening devices in our home. I had previously been temporarily taken away by CPS, and she had my little ass convinced I was going to be ripped out of my bed in the middle of the night for not going to sleep on time or anything as simple as that. I believe it heavily influenced how I felt about myself, and still struggle at nearly 30 to believe that I'm allowed to take up space, make a little noise, and nothing bad will happen as a result. Story 59. My first experience with fan fiction. I was 10 and was just looking through those fanfic edits with different text colors for each character on YouTube. I managed to stumble across one that was just an explicit fic of Draco Malfoy violently raping Hermione that someone had uploaded like one of those Ask Reddit style videos. Looking back on it now, it definitely severely affected my ideas surrounding sexuality, and not in a good way. Story 60. My entire childhood was crazy. My mom used to get us all in the car, or a friend's car, and take us on vacation to different states and once to Canada. She was hiding us from CPS. We finally got picked up at school on April Fool's Day. Story 61. My mom never allowed me to have junk food at home. When I was around 10, my parents got divorced and she started going on dates. On her date nights, she would let me have a bag of chips, but only if I add them in my closet while she left for her date. I have since realized that she couldn't afford a babysitter. She knew I would be fine by myself, but she didn't want her date to know that she was leaving her young child home alone during the date. I was told I could leave the closet when I finished the bag of chips. And then I was home alone, and I watched TV or played Sims or something. Never thought much on this until I told this story to a friend years later, and he looked at me with the WTF face LLing. Story 62. When I was 13-ish, my parents were kicking out my brother from his room in order to rent out the basement. I told him he could have my room, and I moved into the hallway walk-in closet. I was really proud about this at the time, but in hindsight, the fact my family just let me move into a room that basically just fit my bed, and nothing else was a signifier of a lot more problems. I still have difficulty with feeling obligated to sacrifice myself. Story 63. As a kid, our neighbors had kids around the same age as us, but a couple years older. Every other month, these two kids had a new pet, a dog, a cat, an entire aquarium, hamsters, hedgehogs, etc. They would always show us the new pet every couple months. My sister and I asked, "Wow, your house is full of animals." And they looked at us kind of blank. Turns out these animals were all dying after a couple months, weeks in some cases. Family moved away when we were like 12. Just saw that one of them was convicted for murdering his pregnant girlfriend a couple years ago. Story 64. My mom used to give me the silent treatment whenever she was mad at me, like for days on end. Even if I was right, I'd still have to apologize or she'd keep ignoring me. I didn't realize until I hit my 20s or 30s that most moms don't do that. I have borderline personality disorder now. Go figure, LOL. Story 65. I had to go to summer school one year, 7th GR. The school was across town. I walked alone on the first day. There was a girl I knew who lived not too far from me. She showed me how to hitchhike. Some days she didn't go to school, and I'd hitchhike alone. All those who gave us rides were men, and only once when we were together did someone say something off-kilter. He pulled up to the school, and as we reached for the door handles, he said, "Do you know what a pimp is?" I said, "No." My friend, who was in the front seat, said, "Yes." He held out a 100 bill and offered it to us, saying, "Think about all the clothes and shoes we could buy." We both declined and thanked him for the ride. We exited the car and went to class. Woo! When I look back, it was 1,968. We were blessed. A time when we walked everywhere. Story 66. My father wasn't around much for the first 10 years of my life, so after my mom passed, I went to live with him in his new family. Our bonding ritual became me learning how to make him his after-work drink, a perfect Manhattan with a twist of lemon. It took me about a week to get all the measurements right, and about a year and a half before my stepmother realized what I had been doing. I was grounded for 6 months because I should have known better than to play with alcohol. Story 67. My parents used to wake my sister and I up for midnight donuts sometimes. It wasn't until I was grown that I realized that they were some combination of drunk and or stoned whenever we had these trips, and since this was before DoorDash style things, they would wake us young children up, sometimes on school nights, and drive us, while inebriated, to a 24HR donut shop to get donuts for munchies. Again, while I was a kid, this seemed like the coolest surprise ever. But as an adult, it seems kind of fucked in retrospect. Story 68. Not me, but my younger brother. When he was maybe 9, 10, he misbehaved too many times and my mom told him to pack everything he owned. He wasn't allowed to pack clothes or food because our mom owned all that. So he packed anything he'd ever bought with pocket money or wanted arcade games and got in the car. My mom drove to the nearest county road and told him to get out and have a nice life. My extremely naive, possibly on the spectrum, little brother had a full breakdown, promising he'd be good from then on. Once my mom was satisfied with how much he'd cried, she shut the door and took us home. She thinks it's a hilarious anecdote. I'm waiting to see if it comes up at his wedding this summer. Story 69. My mom used to have me come up to her smoking spot in the house for gossip time, which actually meant I would watch my mom get blackout drunk, get secondhand smoke, and then she would offer smokes or booze to keep me around. I thought it was cool that I was so adult for my age, but now I could never imagine doing that to my own child. Past a certain point of night, she would just dead weight pass out, and I would have to prevent her from hurting her head, and then drag her to a safe spot, lift her on the bed, or make a nest for her with pillows keeping her rolled on her side. Story 70. My parents implemented a do-over once. This was around when I was 13. We'd been getting into tons fights. They threatened to kick me out all the time, regularly told me what I was, and had piled punishments and chores up to a year out. Mind you, this was all for struggling through the abuse they put me through and not being able to manage very high expectations, especially when I hadn't been taught how to do a lot. They'd get mad at me for not thinking critically and scream at me and berate me for hours without allowing me to sit, go to the bathroom, or stop looking at them. They would also make sure to make me repeat what they just told me so they could be sure the nasty things they said sunk in. After that, I'd usually be sent to my room for the day-night and have all my privileges removed. No electronics, no art, no reading. I didn't have anything else to do, so I just had to stare at a wall. It wasn't bad for only a day or two, but it ended up being a common punishment for me. At one point, they banned me from checking out books from my school library and started doing bag checks every day after school to make sure I wasn't sneaking books in. Put all the books I owned up into the attic in boxes, threw my computer into the rain, took all my notebooks, read my diary, and made me write sentences all day, every day for weeks. Usually it was really unnecessarily wordy ways of saying, I won't disobey, I'll ask you for everything, and I'm sorry. If I wasn't doing that, I was staring at a wall. This went on for years. Now, with the context out the way, on to the do-over. The purpose of the do-over was to get rid of all my punishments, pretend nothing bad had ever happened, and to just try to be a happy family. At first, I was so excited. The idea of a do-over felt good. Not constantly being on punishment and having my parents being nice to me was so nice. It backfired spectacularly within a few days, of course, because they immediately got angry at me again for forgetting a chore. They didn't even scream at me that time. Just made this face and told me how disappointed they were in me for messing this up and how I'll never get a do-over again because I didn't deserve it. After that, it was back to punishments, back to screaming, back to the threats of being kicked out and abandoned to my grandma, who molested me at a young age. For years, I was so angry and upset with myself for ruining a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not be a screw-up. That feeling's never gone away, and I only realized when I was 22 how fucked up it was. Sorry for the length and intensity of my comment. Story 71. My parents barely talking to each other, having separate bedrooms, and the whole child abuse thing. I only realized how wrong it was when my mother beat me in front of another kid that visited us, and the boy was absolutely horrified. And when I visited a friend from kindergarten, she did something wrong, and I had been flabbergasted that her mom just calmly explained to her what she did wrong and how to prevent it in the future. But it really only occurred to me how bad every single detail really was when I was 19 and spent a lot of time with my then boyfriend's parents, who were great people even though he was a piece of most of the time. Story 72. There was not one single hour of one single day when my dad wasn't drunk. I didn't really process it until I had cut off contact and started to actually unpack and heal. He always smelled like booze. He drove me around when he was buzzed. He was high functioning. He never got truly wasted, and he mostly kept his life together. But he also rearranged his life so that he could drink all day every day. Story 73. So my parents' first place in the U.S. was a pretty comfortable, nice-sized house in Orange County. Kids in the neighborhood and I used to ride bikes, play ball, etc. but the house next to us was eerily quiet and almost seemed abandoned. We often played basketball in the small alley of our house, and we would occasionally peer through the fence. One time, this Korean woman greeted us from there, and she was really friendly. But other than that, the house was the only one that seemed creepily empty. My neighbors would sometimes joke that weird things were happening inside, but none of us really took it seriously. Eventually, my family moved out to another place. It was later when I asked my mom about the house and the neighbors, and she told us the truth. It was owned by a decent Korean-American family whose daughter was suffering demonic possession. The reason why it was quiet was because the family would either take the daughter to church or occasionally invite pastors, house exorcists inside. My mom added that the girl's mother came over one time and told her not to worry if she heard loud noises, which is incredibly WTF in retrospect. Now, I don't believe in exorcism, but my mom said it with such a serious tone, so I couldn't help but believe what she was saying. Supernatural or not, it's pretty messed up that I practically spent my entire elementary school living next to a house with demons, or realistically, a mentally abused girl. Story 74. My family briefly lived out of school district for about 6 months after my parents sold our home to build a new house. This means we technically didn't have a bus stop, but there was no way our parents were going to drive us. We were latchkey kids and heavily relied on our house being walking distance from the bus stop. Well, while we lived out of district in an apartment a few miles over, my brother and I would go home on the bus to our old bus stop and use the house key to our childhood home that we no longer lived in, that had been gutted and repainted by the new owners, but not yet sold to another family. There was no furniture and no flooring. We sat for hours on the floor in the corpse of our childhood home, with no electricity or plumbing until our parents would come pick us up. The entire time we pushed through because we were excited about our new house that we were custom building, but the deal fell through and we didn't get that house. Someone else moved into that one very quickly, and we got a tiny rent house a street over from our dream home. That later got broken into, came home to a garden rock through our back door. Didn't think anything of it, thought it was normal to have to hold your pee for 3 hours after school or pee in the backyard. Ailewa. Story 75. Watching adults cry in church because they were afraid of disappointed God. Anytime they felt like they fell short of perfection, they just sit around castigating themselves and crying because they were just so upset for sucking. Boomer humor in the form of I hate my spouse jokes. Story 76. That they so aggressively wanted my hair to be smooth and silky so they, the adults, could run their hands through it and were so mad when it was tangly and because it got knots so easily. I was a child. As an adult, I learned that my hair is actually wavy, and it wasn't my fault that my hair was so bad, and I should never have had to be surrounded by pedos who always wanted to put their hands on me, no matter how much I never wanted to be touched. And as an adult, I hate my hair, and it stresses me out to no end because nothing I do to care for it works, and I'm autistic with major sensory issues and hair-related trauma. Story 77. My dad was a socially acceptable alcoholic. As in, he made 6 figures in the 90s and was always out at dinners, functions, VIP boxes, at sports, drinking expensive wine and champagne. This progressed to him downing bottles of expensive wine alone at night. Him and my mom separated, and he left her with nothing as a single mom with 3 kids. I slept on the floor of my grand spare bedroom with no mattress for a while, as my mom and little sisters had the bed. She eventually got a council house, government housing. Food banks weren't really a thing back then. At least I'd never heard of them. And my mom used to skip meals so we could eat whilst he was living it up. So from when I was 12, 16, I would skip the train fare to his on a Saturday when he was at a VIP box for football or rugby, use my key to his house and steal food from his house. I'd load my bag up with food, bring it back to my mom's house, and put it in the cupboard without telling her. Deep down, she must have known that this food kept randomly appearing in her house, but I've never told her. I've mentioned this to people before as a funny story, usually previous partners, when they've asked why me and my dad don't get on, before I realized how fucked up it was, and they look at me like that's not funny, that's horrible. So I don't mention it anymore. The rare times I did spend with my dad, it usually ended up with him passed out on the couch drunk, and me having to be the adult. Turn the lights and TV off, put his wine bottle and glass away, etc. She eventually had the courage to divorce him and go to the CSA, a government agency that forced people to pay child support in the UK. I had aged out by then as I was over 18, but she got a couple of thousand a month of him for my sisters, if I recall. He was furious that he had to pay it. He passed away not so long ago due to liver disease. I'll be honest, the thing that hurt the most was he got himself together when I was an adult, stopped drinking, became a better person, and was an incredible grandfather to my little niece. Spent every penny he had on her. She absolutely adored him. And I hated myself for being jealous of her, that she got to have that as her grandfather whilst I just had a drunk alcoholic who left me sleeping on a floor. Story 78. I thought my childhood was a bit fucked up in the fact that I considered it completely normal to have multiple escape routes and places to go in the event that my dad flipped his and crossed the line from emotional and verbal abuse to physical abuse of my identical twin and I. And then I met my husband, whose biological father may have committed some light treason in the process of kidnapping him as a young child and taking him out of the country for 2 years. He then tried to pull the same stunt again when my husband was in high school, but was foiled by my husband's friends, who were extremely protective of him, to say the least. Story 79. Having to assist in renovating old homes from early childhood, kind of concerned about concrete dust and that I might have been exposed to asbestos. Often being expected by my father to just be quiet and go to sleep when I was sick and had a bad sore throat because he refused to give me paracetamol. Also, often being given a nip of overproofed rum as a young kid to try and soothe the sore throat. Somehow, though this also probably put me off alcohol for a long time, so there's that. Stories my grandma used to jokingly recall about how my great-grandmother used to frequently attack my great-grandfather with knives, axes, and improvised cudgels because she'd fly into a blind rage at the drop of the hat. Story 80. Once we got too much groceries, so I was told not to wear my seatbelt and sit sideways. Then Dad came to a rough stop and I flew off my chair and landed in blackberries. And now I had squished blackberries all over my ass. I went inside a mall food court to clean it off, and my mom just started wiping at it and I had to make her stop. Mom cleaning mode kicks in even when people are around, I guess. Then I went to the bathroom and took care of it. Glad we didn't get hit by a car. Seems really dumb now. Story 81. My authoritarian, hyperconservative, fundamentalist religious parents created a culture of fear and punishment to control me and my siblings. They denied us privileges that included privacy, food, birthdays, and breaks from school when we were disobedient. I was once grounded for all of spring break, couldn't leave my room except for meals, no phone, no magazines, only religious books or music. My brother and I lost the privilege of a door on our shared bedroom once, and our beds were traded out for army cots. I genuinely thought at the time, and for a few years later, that there was something wrong with me because I just couldn't seem to string together much time without up somehow. At the time, this seemed totally normal. And we even had people in our religious community who had the same parenting style. It's not like they were whipping us or putting out cigarettes on us, right? I realize now that this was clearly abuse and likely criminal neglect. Story 82. I was punished for anyone else's perceived wrongdoings in the house. Like Dad spying on me like a hawk. Even the way I chew or held my fork was wrong, so I got slapped daily at the dinner table. Or little sister tearing my school books to confetti. I was spanked for letting it happen while she laughed her head off. But if I ever tried to not let it happen, I'd then be spanked for meddling and being mean to my little sister. You'd think it was just my dad, but it continued after he left us, just in more subtler ways. Less spanking, more ostracizing. Back in the day, 70s, 80s, it was run-of-the-mill, not considered abusive to slap and spank children. Heck, in France, you'd still find martinets in every village store, several leather strips tied to a wooden shaft that were used on bad kids. My father was considered progressive, soft almost, because he didn't own one. So I have CPTSD, and my sister, who never hit a boundary, no matter how far she went in the abusive behavior, is a massive narcissist and an alcoholic since age 15. Story 83. My dad, when returning from my doctor's appointments with me, they were specialists in the outskirts of Chicago, and stopped by the liquor store. Get a six-pack, driving the country roads back home, and toss the empty cans out the window. Also, I was always expected to know better. But my parents allowed people to treat me younger than I was. I'm a little person. Proportional, though. My dad liked to joke, even if it upset us. He once had us kids walk into an old Western jail cell, shut the door on us, and then proceed to leave. We were really young. Story 84. Among other things I normalized for decades, For years, I had vague memories of my parents traveling to Europe without me when I was young, leaving my brother and I with our aunt and uncle for about a week. Decades later, and years following our parents' deaths, we were visiting with the same aunt and uncle, and said trip was brought up. As it happens, our folks were away for over 6 weeks. I was 2 at the time and couldn't process what was happening. Additionally, there was a postal strike in Europe, and no letters came. I verbally wrote off our parents, believing that they were dead. And when they finally returned, I apparently screamed and pulled away from them, wanting to stay with my wonderful aunt and uncle. This whole epiphanic conversation clarified the hell out of the abandonment issues I've carried ever since. Story 85. My high school principal told me I was a waste of space, waste of my parents' taxes, and that I should just stop showing up because I'm wasting their time when it could be better spent helping someone who matters. When I was 15, a few days prior, she printed copies of our student ranking and GPA. Not individual reports, but everyone now knows they're standing against every other student in school. I was 4th last in our grade, so this was her response. My mom didn't believe me until I told my grandparents, who threatened to go to the superintendent, the school board, the local news, etc. Then she believed me. She got a family member who's got some power in the school district involved, who didn't do. She also confronted her at the local supermarket one day, and that doubled down on what she said to me and said some other about me. My mom wouldn't say what. I wasn't the only one she said this to either. She told like 8 other students too. Their parents didn't care though, so they got to stay at the school for another year before she moved to another district, left and retired. I used to be cool about it, laugh it off, make jokes about it. But as I've gotten older, whenever I things up or make mistakes, it's like I flash back to that moment and hear her saying that to me all over again. I didn't stand up for myself back then, and it took telling my grandparents for me to realize the gravity of how fucked up that was. Story 86. My younger sister has complex medical issues, so I grew up with the understanding that she could die at basically any time. I knew what to do, where to go if my mom had to call an ambulance while my dad was out of town. I knew what to do for a seizure and basically on preventing them, and I knew the names of all her medications. She has improved greatly since then, but wow, that was weird in hindsight. Story 87. I've had a very strange blend of a colorful, dark life. So I have a lot of examples, unfortunately, but the one that always rings as particularly odd in my mind is my mother sitting me down and describing in great detail what I was to do if an intruder broke into the house and dragged her into the bedroom with a gun. I remember the sentences, "You aren't going to go, oh, I can't lift the baby carrier. You're just going to be able to pick it up and go." My sibling was a newborn at the time. And after I questioned the gun prompt, it was rather specific for her. I remember the wide eyes as she said, "Anything can happen." My mother was always very open with me, treating me more like a friend than a son. In many ways great, but other ways not so much. So this kind of thing wasn't too out of the ordinary to her. But recalling that particular time in my life, I was 11, I think. Outside circumstances with particular people could have lined up to that event in a darker timeline. Story 88. My brother was super into pranking as a kid. No idea where that started, but we once were on top of a hiking place. Back then there wasn't any rails preventing accidents. My brother pretended to push me from behind as a joke, and I thought I was going to get yeeted off the cliff. That's where I began to have a fear of heights, I think. I don't know if this counts as harmless. It felt harmless because he didn't really push me. He just placed his hands on my back, and yeah. Story 89. Being born to old parents, my mother was 45 and dad was 48 when I was born. As a kid, it was fun, and I was rather spoiled. More money, larger house, etc. than my friends with parents in their 20s, 30s. Having to put your young adult life on hold and do elder care for dementia in your 20s is not fun at all, especially with no siblings to help or tell you what to do. Story 90. When I was a child, I was in my bedroom one day, just playing with my dolls. I look up and there's an old man staring in my window. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't a relative, and we didn't have any visitors over. As soon as I look, he whips his head out of view. I don't react, but I remember wondering if I saw that or not. I don't tell anyone and didn't until last year when I mentioned it to my sister. She didn't comment on it though. We lived out in the country. Dense trees and a river surrounded our house, although it wasn't deep woods. So if it was the neighbors, they must have either cut through the trees and river, or they walked down their long-ass driveway, then up our driveway, just to prowl at the windows. I shudder to think what would happen if my window was open, or I was playing out the back of the house where he was. And for added creepiness, our house was haunted. Someone had died there, although they didn't cause the haunting feeling. And the trees surrounding our house were very creepy and dense and sucked the light and heat from the atmosphere. I hated being around that side of the house because I always felt like I was being watched. Something was in the trees. Very weird things happened on that property. So I wonder if it was real or a figment of my imagination, although I've carried the memory for 20-odd years. Story 91. I think I was around 8 or 10. My narcissistic grandmother was raising me. My mother not wanting kids, so she was just visiting me every day. She lived across the road. Every time our cat was giving birth, or if someone threw a bag of newborn cats into our courtyard, my grandmother drowned them. Until one day when she made me do it because it was the humane way to deal with the poor kittens. I remember crying like crazy, being afraid of her, and drowning the poor kittens. To this day, I can't forgive myself for doing it. Now I'm 30. I also have a cat that it's one of the loves of my life. Story 92. Most of these stories make mine sound very tame. In the early 90s, our parents moved out to the country because it was the only place we could afford to buy a house. The village is now a commuter domicile with literally hundreds of new houses every few months. Farmers sold off their land, I guess. Anyway, I was 5 and my brother was 8 when we moved there. Parents would wake us up at 5:30 to make sure we ate breakfast before they left at 6. My brother would make us a packed lunch for school, and we'd leave and walk 2 miles to school. Then we'd walk home and be alone until 6 or 7 p.m. when they finished work. I'm surprised we didn't get into more shenanigans, to be honest. I opted to read and study and became a clever child, but burnt out after high school. We both have horrible relationships with food, I guess, because sometimes we didn't want dinner at 8 p.m. because we were tired after being up at 5 a.m. Sometimes I eat 10 0-cals a day. Sometimes I don't eat for 2 days. Story 93. When I was a child, my sister, who's older than me, was the one who took care of me for the most part. Divorced parents, emotionally absent mother, and emotionally abusive father. She got the little love and attention our parents hardly ever give. At first, someone outside that saw her being careful and worried about me could think, what a great sister. The truth was that, but not only that she was a great sister.